Tonight we're going to be talking about how we got to now, from the settlers in the Wimberley area to the subdivisions in the Wimberley area. We're going to take a look at the geological history, just very, very briefly, some written history from around the... Yeah, kill the middle light. That better? Yes. We're going to do a little bit of written history around the War of Independence for Texas, which is when the land grant system sort of comes into play. And then we're going to look at aerial photos from 1953 to present in a quadrant in which Wimberley will be at this corner of the screen, and it'll be north and east of Wimberley. So as we all know, in the geology, in the Cretaceous, we were in a shallow sea, and it deposited the Trinity and the Edwards formations, typical formations people have heard about. In the Cretaceous, we had come out of the sea had receded. In the seas go in, seas go out story with geologists, you don't know which happened, whether the land came up or the water went down. Probably in this case, the water went down. The real point, though, is the ancestral creeks that ran across this valley of all of Hays County penoplaned this area. Peneplaning means making flat. And those are now the tops of what we call hills. They aren't actually hills. They're actually what's left after the valleys got taken away from it. So about 20 to 10 million years ago, the Balcones fault system started to relax. The Gulf Coast started to sink. It's still sinking. And the big pluton that we call enchanted rock, that pink granite pluton, held up the hill country. Didn't let it keep sliding towards the ocean, or the Gulf of Mexico. And that's when the rivers and the creeks started digging these valleys. So in geologic cross-section, that's what this looks like. Here's the Balcones fault system. And it's got the Edwards here is an aquifer. The Edwards, where we live up here in the hill country, is at the very tops of the hills. It's what's left after the rivers eroded away all of the valleys. So here we are back at that same photograph. That's the Blanco River snaking through there. That's east. This is Lone Man Creek, and that's the Unity Church for people that are familiar with the Unity Church. We're going to look at a cross-section through that where the yellow stripe is, and this is what the elevation looks like. So starting over here at this end, this is where it hadn't been eroded too much. This is down into here. This is the Blanco River. This is Lone Man Creek. In between Lone Man Creek and the river and the Blanco is a ridge. And then it goes back up towards River Mountain Ranch. Okay? So this is what didn't get eroded, and there is in fact Edwards on the top of that piece right there, where that happens to go through our property. Okay, so over here, the Blanco River has managed to erode away 330 feet deep. Whereas over here, the Lone Man Creek doesn't have enough water to do that in that much time, so it's only 250 foot deep, the valley. And this part is a 50% slope up here. And you walk that by grabbing a hold of trees. And over here, it's even steeper. That's the Calvert's Cliff. So this is the Trinity, and all of this is the Trinity. It's at the very top, which isn't in the cliff, that you get the little bit of Edwards left. This caves in on a regular basis, and down here there are big blocks of limestone that have fallen into the creek. You don't really want to be messing around real close to the cliff. That's a pretty steep overhang. The ravens used to nest here when this piece was actually still attached, but their nest kind of went down when it fell off. And they have not re-nested there. They nest now in a tree on the Calvert's property. Now, there are two main concepts that were prevalent in the minds of Americans, or settlers, if you will. One of them, and the Europeans in particular, drove this because there wasn't anything like pristine nature in Europe. So when they came to America and they saw deep grasslands like tall grass prairies, they assumed that that was the work of nature. Nature did that all by herself, because heaven forbid those savages running around in loincloths couldn't possibly have been a major factor in this process. So they saw big blue stem, they saw switchgrass, they saw all these deep, this is big blue. They saw that and they just were convinced that it was done by nature. But they were wrong. It was done by buffalo and fire, controlled by the Native Americans, who had been managing this landscape for not decades, not centuries, millennia. When we got here, they had been decimated by, guess what? Disease that we brought. Because remember, this is the 1850s. We've been messing around here in America for a while. And so what happened was the Indians followed the buffalo north and south on their migration path. And when they would leave the hill country and head for Nebraska and further north, the Indians would go back and set fire. So they would take this crappy scruff that was left after the buffalo had chewed this stuff down all winter. And after the fire, they were gone. They didn't care at that point. This is one of the key things about this method of land management, is you have to not have a house where you're going to put the fire. So they took their house with them, so that wasn't a problem for them. And when they came back in the next fall, the grassland would have recovered, and it would look like this again. And if it didn't quite recover, they didn't have fences, so the buffalo could go a little bit further east or west and avoid the place where it hadn't quite gotten back to full speed. This is so simple. Fire and rotational grazing. That is the message. We now sell it at our extension agents. Fire and rotational grazing. But when the settlers got here, they didn't get it. They reported it. They knew that the Indians would actually set fires. They didn't understand why. And it couldn't possibly be the Indians because they didn't have the plow, and they didn't have the gun, and they didn't have all the things that, although Leopold tells us, we now have to use to fix it. Okay, the other key thought process in the minds of the settlers was the concept of manifest destiny. That is, their manifest destiny. They believed that they had a manifest destiny to populate America, or actually the New World. And so they didn't mind displacing the Native Americans. They didn't mind displacing blacks that happened to be here from previous times. And their head rights and land grant system embedded this in this idea of manifest destiny was part of their land grant system. So before Mexico won its independence from Spain, people called impresarios contracted with Spain. This says Mexico, but there's actually, these people contracted with Spain, then they contracted with Mexico, then they contracted with the Republic of Texas, and then they contracted with the state of Texas. So there were 4 units that these impresarios worked with. The idea from the Spanish was to populate this part of the New World with Catholics, because this was in the era of the Spanish Inquisition and all that. So they required these people to at least profess to be Catholics. And these are areas that were assigned to various impresarios. Impresario in Spanish means entrepreneur. And one of those entrepreneurs, one of the more successful ones, is this guy. You've probably heard of him, Stephen F. Austin. This is a map from 1833. This is after Mexico won its independence from Spain. And it's the Cojilla and Tejas map. Okay, so when Texas won its independence, oh, I left something out. To encourage people to move into these areas, which did have Comanches and Apaches, they gave them a league, which is a little over 4,400 acres, and for grazing, and a labor, 177 acres for farming. Okay, so it's called a league and a labor. You'll hear that, or you'll read about it if you check into this stuff. They don't talk about, because they were still using the Spanish system of measurements. They don't talk about acres. So when Texas won its independence, it said, you know what? We'll give the people that were here before we really started the big-ass fighting, we'll give them the same thing the Spanish did, 4,600 acres. And if they showed up a little later, we'll give them 1,280 acres, because they still wanted to attract people. And if they showed up even later, they said, we'll give them 640 acres, and if they showed up even later, they gave them the 640 acres, but they actually had to go there and cultivate 10 of those acres with something. This is one of the head right land grant documents. This one happens to be for a single person, a single man. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah, it works, sort of. A single man, so he only got half of what the married people got. So it paid to be married. Not only did they do that for the immigrants, that is people coming in either from America or from, because this is the Republic now, either coming in from the United States or coming in from Europe. They were looking for white folks. They also gave anybody that fought in the war a first class, as long as they served through the whole war. Now, they actually did have a policy that if they didn't serve through the whole war, they gave the portion that they did serve to the widow. So it wasn't completely, you made it or you didn't get anything. And this is part of how that worked. The military bounty grants would give them 320 acres for every 3 months of fighting. Okay? So if they stuck it out the whole war, they got the same as a second-class immigrant did. Does this make sense? Okay.
You talking about the Civil War?
The War of Independence with Texas. This is just after San Jacinto. Okay. The key thing to take away from this is the belief in manifest destiny underwrote this whole process. There was no concern about Native Americans. Now here's one of those documents. Yeah.
Can you explain what land rights were given to non-Texans before the Texas Revolt by Mexico?
That was what the impresarios were doing.
So they were giving them not only to Mexican citizens, but also to...
Oh no, most of it was actually attracting people not from Mexico. They were attracting in people from the southern U.S. And by the way, that's why slavery made it into Texas, is because they brought them in out of Georgia and slave-owning states. Tennessee, yeah.
So the Mexican government actually invited in Americans to be residents.
Yeah, which is kind of duh. But that's what they were doing, and there was actually some method to that madness. One was they had to get somebody in there, or America would just take it over. They did anyway, but they didn't expect a war. And the other thing is, they formed a buffer between the real Mexicans, because they had to actually become citizens of Mexico to get that land from the impresarios. They were Mexican citizens, but they were like naturalized Mexican citizens. Between the real Mexicans, south of the Rio Grande, this was a buffer to the Apaches. So they had to get people in that wanted to stick it out through thick and thin. And they wanted, the Spanish wanted Catholics, and they made you profess to be Catholic. The Mexicans didn't require Catholicism, but they did ban slavery, but Texas didn't pay attention to that, even though, anyway, here's, the thing was, oh, yeah.
If Mexico gave rights to somebody and then the Republic of Texas came along, did they honor those rights?
Yes, yes. For almost, I'll show you one place on a map where there's still some dispute, but yes, in general, there was if you got the land from Mexico, you were a Mexican citizen just like I was, Mr. Stephen F. Austin, and so we're now just going to let you keep your land. And there were head rights written to that effect that documented that not the change of ownership, but who you got it from, Texas or whatnot. Anyway, what may not have been clear when I was doing this is these head rights didn't actually refer to a specific piece of land. They referred to a specific amount of land. It was up to you to go find some vacant land and patent it by having it surveyed. And I'll show you how that worked. So here's one of these patent paperwork. It's amazing. You can get all this stuff scanned off everything I'm showing you, you can get off the internet free. This one is for Mr. Charles McKim, May of 47. I'll zoom up on that for you. And his right was he is entitled to have surveyed by any legally authorized surveyor upon any vacant and unappropriated public domain of, in this case, the state of Texas, because by 47 it was the state, not the republic. The point is, vacant and unappropriated included all the Indian land, anything that wasn't owned by a white man was vacant and unappropriated. Now the surveyor system is actually something you have to take all those things where you saw the settlers running out in their buggy and they find some land and they put stakes in the ground and they go back to the land office and get it approved. That didn't happen here. The way it worked here was you showed up with your little piece of paper, this one over here on the right, to the land district, and you said, I'm good for, in his case, a whole lot, 9 million acres, and I'd like some out of Hays County, maybe north of the Blanco if you can get it. And they would send out their surveyors. state contractors to survey you a piece of land which just happened to be contiguous with the last one they did and was rectangular. And so you ended up with maps. Oh, and this is one of those surveys. Here's that rectangular survey, and that's the resulting maps. Almost everything's rectangular. There's a couple that are kind of cattywampus, but they're mostly rectangular as long as you aren't on the Blackland Prairie. Because the Blackland Prairie area, east of 35, most of that was actually settled by those impresarios and the people they brought in, and they cared about being close to water and all that stuff. Here, they didn't really care. You got a pig in a poke when you got this back. But the good news was you could sell that right. And if you didn't patent it, it didn't matter to you. You just sold the right to somebody else, and they go patent it. And in fact, very few of the people whose names you see on here probably ever set foot on that land, because most of them were not actually patented by the people whose name is on that map. I've gone through a bunch of them. This is Wimberley. This is their depiction of the Blanco River, incorrect. This is Cypress Creek, also incorrect. And, well, they basically just took little squiggly lines off the main river. But I'll show you that later. That's old Charles McKim's land, but it wasn't that whole headright. You could actually say, oh, I want, if you had a big piece, you could say, I want 640 acres out of Hayes County. I want 500 acres out of, well, actually they like 320 and 640 and that sort of thing. I want 320 out of Travis County. So you could sort of play the odds of which one would happen to have something useful on it that you could sell. Okay, so where are we? That's Charles McKim. This is really Wimberley. That's where they thought it was. This is where it really is. This is Ranch Road 12 on the way to Dripping. This is 2325. That's 181. That's, what's the road out there that goes to the dance hall on the other side of the Blanco? Yeah, Fisher Store Road, I think. And this is 3237. That's the run back from the corner of 32, where 3237 heads off towards Hayes County Store. This is like Lone Man Mountain Road. Okay? We're going to be focusing on that quadrant, 12, 32, 37, Lone Man Mountain Road. But you can see it, you can pretty much see that it's the same kind of land. Oh, this is one of the, this is one of the disputed pieces of property. Jesus Perez and Amelia Wilson. Anyway, so what built around this whole system was a thing called land agents. Have you ever heard of real estate agents? Well, these were real estate agents with steroids. They basically bought up these patents, or bought up just the head rights and patented them. And then they'd aggregate them into bigger parcels, because those things are not very big. Those 640 acres in the hill country isn't going to grow you very many cattle. And so they would build these bigger packages and sell the package. At one time, one of the guys was Jacob de Cordova. He published this map. This is a later version, but the first one was published in 1849. At one time, he owned 1 million acres of property through purchasing people's head rights. So what happened in the 1840s and 50s in this map area? Well, by the mid-1800s, almost all the land in that map that I showed you was already patented. And so people could actually buy something that wasn't an amount of land. It was a specific parcel of land, okay? So that was an important thing. If it hadn't been patented, you don't know where that 640 acres was. Okay, and so they began to really settle on this. So in the 1800s, land was required to make a living. It was a 2-day ride to San Marcos from Wimberley. You went there, stayed overnight, and came back, and it was a hard 2 days. So they also had fairly large families. And so what did they do? They didn't have tools to dig wells through limestone. So they lived near live water. They raised their own cows, sheep, goats, pigs, everything. And they plowed any suitable land for row crops because this community of Wimberley had to be self-sustaining. They had a grist mill here in Wimberley. You've probably heard of it. That turned grain crops into flour, and then they had lumber mills that would turn the huge cypress trees that used to shade the entire run of the Blanco. They turned them into timber and shingles. And they cut down the mature ash juniper for rot-resistant timbers and fence posts. During that time, whole wagon trains of fence posts would leave Wimberley and go to Corpus Christi because they were having trouble with all that pine fence posts rotting off. They hadn't discovered womanized lumber yet. Okay, and so here's the map. This is a contour map of the exact same area that you saw before. So here's Wimberley, here's the Blanco River, here's Cypress Creek, this is Lone Man Creek, that's the Unity Church right there. And this is Lone Man on up, and this is Smith Creek.
Is that creek to the top right up there? In that top corner, is that Onion?
Yes, I think it is. This is Onion.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did the settlers do to this property? Well, this was flat, so it makes good farming. In fact, Mendocino Farms is still there. So it does work as good farming to this day. That was deep soils with tall grass, and there were pocket prairies along all of these creeks and rivers because there are deep soils right up against the river in many places, up against the creek and up against the river. We have 10-foot pilings. It took 8 feet of that to get the limestone. Right next to the creek. You go to the other side of the house, it sits on limestone. So there are these pocket prairies, and in fact those early photographs I showed you of native grasslands, deep tall grass prairies, they were taken in a pocket prairie in one of our state native tallgrass prairie preserves. So that's what they did to that. They turned it into row crop farms. Over here, they were on fairly flat ground up higher. This is 32, 37. And this is 150. This is you're right. That is Onion Creek. Okay, so up here they had less soil. But they had mid-height grasses. Mid-height grasses are this tall as opposed to this tall. And they turned those into cattle ranches. That was the most successful cattle ranches. And that's River Mountain Ranch, who you're looking at. Okay, on the steep slopes, like around Lone Man Creek and Smith Creek, it was too steep for cattle. You couldn't plow it. So, and it had mainly short grasses, so they turned it into sheep and goat ranches. We have documentations of this happening. I'll show it up later. And in the really steep sections, like here along the Blanco, or like here along Lone Man Creek, 50% slope. That transect I showed you earlier went right through there. That's a 50% slope. We own it. I know how steep it is. That was left alone. And they used it for game, turkeys, deer, things like that. That is the only part of the hill country the settlers didn't screw up. Many of these are absolutely original forests still, because it was too steep to log, and somehow it managed not to get burned. Okay, so here is that same map. This green outline is the Lowman Creek watershed, and I'm going to show you that watershed that was used for sheep and goats on the other map. These are co-registered maps. So Charles McKim had a good chunk of it, James Smith had a good chunk of it, Jesse had some of it, Lansing and Pace. This is what is now called, oh, help me out, folks. The subdivision, Skyline Ranches, sorry. I should have hit that. So that's Skyline Ranches, and that's the Charles McKim survey. So what happened in Skyline Ranch? In 1849, Charles McKim managed to patent it, and he got 1,653 acres that included that Skyline Ranch. Barbed wire was introduced to the area in 1870. That was really bad news for the grasses, because now you could keep the cows eating it till it got to the dirt. And the Gay family showed up in 1882 and bought 6,000 acres, which included Skyline Ranch, and they introduced sheep. And we all know what happens. Oh, this is the root system of prairie. This is a fantastic diagram, by the way. Root system of prairie plants in deep soil, okay? And that's the 5-foot mark. Gives you an idea of how deep this, when you have it. And that's why the pocket prairies would grow along those streams and rivers, because guess what? It's 8 feet deep. Some places like at Mendocino Farms, it's probably almost 20 feet deep looking at the cut on the river. But of course, we know when you overgraze it, you end up, this is little blue stem, by the way, at varying grazing levels. The roots go away. When the roots go away, the water infiltration goes away. When their water infiltration goes away, the creeks become less steady and whole springs just dry up. By the 1920s, the lush grassland savannas that the settlers came in and thought was pristine nature, they had pretty well chewed it up. It was now infested by brush. What do you mean low battery? And things were about to get much worse.
This is true all the way up through the Midwest. Nebraska, all the way up through, right?
Yeah, this is the same story all along. Okay, so what happened? In the 1930s, we had the Dust Bowl. Prolonged drought, dry weather, lack of fire, continued overgrazing. They pushed many of the properties past the tipping point, and because people couldn't afford to get rid of the cedar, basically. And non-native improved grasses were introduced at that time to hold down erosion. They quickly jumped out of their intended purpose and started infiltrating the grasslands. And so we had kind of an overall problem. And that's when in the 1940s, before the Second World War, the hill country took on the war on cedar. And in 1940, we have documentation that it was chained. And I'll show you what chaining means here in a minute. What you do with a chain is you take 2 bulldozers and you hook it together with an anchor chain off of a major ship, and you drag it across the land, just ripping everything out. And here's what it looks like. There's the two bulldozers. There's the chain. But here's what it looks like in action. You may be wondering, well, these things are only laying down, they'll come back. Well, they ran back across it the other direction to snap them off. Now, what do you think that is? Cactus. Cactus. Now, what happens when you spread cactus around on the land? You get a lot more cactus. And you've seen properties that have been chained because they typically either don't have any soil, or if they had soil, they got a lot more cactus than they did before this process. Okay, this is 1953, aerial photo, same place, here we are. This is Lowman Creek, this is Smith Creek, that's Cypress Creek. Look at this area here. It's a little messy over here, but you can pretty well see a line, a property management line. This is what we know was chained, that's Skyline Ranch. The rest of that looks a lot like Skyline Ranch did. There's a good chance that 4,000 acres were chained at that point. The chaining happened in 2 batches. I need your phone, Fox, pretty soon. I'm going to have to switch to yours.
You took it already.
Oh, I did? Oh, then it's here. It happened before the war and after the war, because during the war they didn't want to give away bulldozers and anchor chains. So before the war, it was much harsher. It was what I showed you, absolute devastation. After the war, they got a little smarter, and we're going to zoom in on an area that was done after the war because this is 1953, and that's what it looks like in that little area. Now, take a look at this. Look at how stripy this is, and how these stripes don't have anything to do with the land. They're just up and down the hills. This distance between that dark spot and that dark spot is 75 feet, the length of a chain, drug as a curve behind bulldozers. After the war, a lot of the chaining actually avoided running over, it kind of sounds stupid, they didn't run over the oaks anymore. They didn't just take out everything. They actually tried to avoid a lot of the better trees. And in fact, in 1967, you can still see this thing actually has quite a bit of trees compared to that bare area that I showed you before. But by 2017, nobody kept that up, and the cedar's back. If you go drive in here, you can get into this area in a few places, like here. You can actually see the little trees that they protected, but they're just encroached now by cedar again. But the trees are there, you can see, and they're old. They're not young trees. Okay, so here we are back to that original 4,000 acres of chaining, and we're going to look at a different area. We're going to look at this little funny Chinese character. And when you look at it, you can see those same stripes. I'll zoom in on it, make it a little easier. Those are 70 to 75 feet apart. This is all done in Google Earth. You can measure it. This is what it looked like in '67. You can see they left a bunch of trees. And this is what it looks like in 2017. This is the north part of River Mountain Ranch. So a lot of the cedars come back, but not as bad as some other places. Okay, but not every property was chained. Remember, we looked at these kinds of things. We're going to zoom into there. What happened outside that 4,000 acre box We're going to look at that. Next, here it is. This is chained. This is not chained. I'm going to walk through these fairly quickly. Here it is in 1967. Here it is in 1995. These people are losing the battle over here. The cedar's coming back. They're not taking care of it. And here it is in 2004 when we can finally get some free infrared images. Infrared, how many of you know infrared? The redder the better. The bright red magenta is deciduous. The dark gray is not deciduous. It's in general in the hill country, if it's bright pink, it's either grass or trees. This is grass. And this is an example of grass and trees together. But if it's this kind of trying to be red but really gray, it's cedar. So we'll zoom in a little tighter. Here's the grassland in the low. Here's the decent trees that they managed to keep. This is a mixed one. These people basically, all that came back here was the cedar. Okay, so we're going to zoom back out and I'm going to show you 1953 against 2017. So basically where they had put all that effort into destroying the land, they lost the war anyway. This is 1953 again. We're going to jump over, This is the whole picture in infrared. Notice how gray that area is compared to everything else. That's because if you go there, it's almost all limestone with a little bit of seep muley and a little bit of grammas. Grammas and seep muley can hang on to that barren landscape. Almost nothing else can. They're small patches of little bluestem. Next, we're going to jump down here to this area that we looked at early on. That's the Unity Church. And we're going to look at this set. I want you to pay attention. Well, first of all, I'll do the 3237, Lowman Creek, Smith Creek, and now, whoops. I want you to pay attention, this is 2017. I want you to pay attention to what happens here and what doesn't happen here. 1953, the top of this ridge was bulldozed. I know that because you can find the piles of cedar that are still there. This is, the slopes were burned, cut and burned. Keep looking up here for changes up there. Here we are, this is now starting to come back on the top. Didn't last too long. This is now 1962. This is 1967. Some of our best images are from then. This is still pretty well bare, and today it's so tall, mainly in some cedar. This has been cleared a lot, but look at how judiciously it was cleared. You don't see stripes. They basically went in there with machetes and chainsaws. By 1967, chainsaws were light. In 1949, chainsaws took 2 people. They had steel crankcases. They had wheels on the one end. Here we are in 1990, and here we are in 1995, and finally here's our infrared in 2004. All this bright stuff is very large deciduous trees that the settlers didn't get to. That's all pristine forest. The top has been bulldozed twice. And this is coming back to me mainly cedar. But if you look, what was kept in this valley was mainly the deciduous trees, because the people that owned it were rich. The Moody's, as in Galveston Moody. And they could afford to pay people to go do surgical cutting of trees, and juniper and whatnot. Whereas the other people were probably not so wealthy, and they did it the expedient way, which is pull the chain across it. Okay, so agricultural land turns into subdivisions. Over a century of poor management, all that chaining, the war on cedar, just was not good enough. It didn't work. By early 2000s, when we moved here, and many of you became master naturalists about that time, Brian Davis told us there were only a handful of people in all of Hays County that could make a living off the land. The others had a wife in town that had a good job. Large property owners had been selling off their property to make ends meet for decades. And from the 40s on, it was increasingly subdivided into home sites. And that's because the land no longer needed to make a living. The money was coming from somewhere else, 401ks, Social Security, investments of other kinds. Worn out ag land became some of the most desirable home sites in the world, because they look out over that. They were terrible places in the settlers' days because there wasn't any live water up at the top of these hills. And finally, the epic 1,000-acre battles that we saw they turned into 5-acre skirmishes by landowners. Okay, so here we are back at our map, and that is what it looks like today. I'll back up on that. So that is called land fragmentation.
It's called what?
Land fragmentation. This is the current subdivisions off the Hays-Cad map. And I'm going to go through them real quickly in time, from 1947 through about 1996. Okay? So there, 1947, that's Flight Acres. Deer Lake Estates. You guys live in Deer Lake Estates. 1948. That was turned into waterfront property by putting a whole crap load of dams along a dry creek. This is Arrow Lake Acres, 64. Here's Wood Creek, that's only part of it, 71. This is Tiburon, 73. Wood Creek Ranches, 1977. And Rancho Grande, 83. Skyline Ranch Estates up there finally turned into a subdivision in 84. River Mountain Ranch in 95. The Red Hawk Road area, which actually includes 5 subdivisions, was subdivided in around 1996.
Can you go back to River Mountain Ranch a minute? Can you go back to River Mountain Ranch?
No, we go the other way.
No, can you back up?
Can you see it?
Oh. Yeah, there's River Mountain Ranch.
Okay, I tried to see what it
This is the actual River Mountain Ranch entrance road. This is the cattle guard. You drive in here and you go either left or right. You go down to the river park down here.
So I see where our place is, just off by the cattle guard.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you're in here.
Yep.
Okay, so River Mountain Ranch was done in 1995. And the area of Red Hawk Road was done around 1996. Back here, when we were looking at this one, that is Wood Creek Ranches This part of the Red Hawk area was attempted to be subdivided twice in the 70s. And it failed because of bad luck, having hit things like the oil embargo. And they were depending on people driving over here from Houston for vacation homes. And there were several kind of bad economic things happen. 2 different oil embargoes affected Red Hawk Ranch, which we're thrilled to have happen. No, actually we're just thrilled that it didn't screw up our land. Okay, so Escondida just got done, and at one time we thought, oh wow, look at that, those things are big enough to do wildlife management, but unfortunately they're running exotic game in it. Okay, but there was and still is hope. What's good for wildlife is usually good for the watershed. It reduced livestock and grazing, more native grasses, forbs, less mowing, produces more water, more steady flow in the creeks, all that stuff we all know. Wildlife management tax evaluation became an option in 1995. That's why Red Hawk Ranch survived. Red Hawk area survived, because they could go wildlife management on 25 acres and not go broke on taxes. Okay, Melissa told us recently, last July, that there was 8,000 total ag properties in Hays County. 2,600 of those are, only 2,600 of those are actually under wildlife management. The others can't be making any money. So there are 5,400 ag properties that can be relatively easily converted to wildlife if the owners chose to do it. So this is how it worked in the Red Hawk Road area. There are 5 subdivisions, and maybe Escondida, we thought at one time. It began being subdivided in 1995 into 25-acre parcels. They kept the tax evaluation by leasing the land for cattle. Some of the owners, like Larry Calvert and then Siri and Susan and Lewis and others, fairly quickly converted to wildlife management. Others converted over the next decade. The point is, this wasn't a concerted effort. This wasn't people going door to door saying, please, please, please become go on wildlife. This was just a set the example, let the other people see it. Today, 2,000 contiguous acres are under wildlife management, 60 plus properties ranging from 25 to 170 acres in 5 different subdivisions. So it can happen, and it doesn't take all you have to have is the incentive to not have cow poop in your front lawn to keep your your ag evaluation, and switch to, and in fact, Larry says he went to wildlife because the cattle were actually eating his foundation while he was building the house. Okay, so there's the 2,000 acres, including those. We're going to look at that piece. This is that one you first looked at. We're going to look at it from this direction, looking south. That's what it looks like. That's Unity Church. That's our place, Winifred Shirley, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's Cheryl Davis up there. That's the actual land plats.
It's the what?
The land, property lines. Now, watch what happens. You notice where the property lines were? That's because it's all under wildlife and the people all think about the same. There are fences in many of those yellow areas. There are fences. They're barbed wire fences. Some of them are actually wood fences. But the wildlife see this. They see 300 and some odd acres of grassland savanna. They see this pristine, original the forest on the steep slopes. So the wildlife see a completely different picture than the taxman sees. But wildlife management is nice, but it's not actually necessary. You don't need wildlife management tax evaluation to reduce runoff and retain more water on your property. You don't need it to encourage native grasses and forbs to grow to maturity and seed out, and to mow less often and less short. That can all be done by individual landowners, all at their own volition, and we can do these things as an individual, or we can do it as a community of like-minded neighbors. And as always, change starts with one property owner deciding to do what is right for their land. And hopefully, the others in the neighborhood will see that. That's how we got to now with a hopeful future through wildlife management and neighbors working together to create a seamless landscape. That's the, I made it.
Pretty good.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, so we live at River Mountain Ranch, and we understand it's like a big ranch with many, many cattle that roam free, more or less. They can't roam on our little lot because we got a fence, but
Yeah, Melissa actually told us they will still do aggregate. They will still let people aggregate properties. River Mountain Ranch in general, the property sizes are small enough that the part they carve out for your house and driveway and garage and whatnot reduces the remaining land that can be turned to wildlife probably too much. But there are a lot of other subdivisions, and even parts of River Mountain Ranch, that can aggregate large enough parcels of
we do
land.
get a lot of wildlife. We get a lot of deer,
Yeah,
stuff like that.
but the real question then is, what benefit would it be to you? If you already have that wildlife, why would you want to convert to wildlife? Because it's the same, the taxes are flat, they're the same. You can run cattle, sheep, goats, or you can manage for wildlife. And it's actually harder to manage for wildlife because you have to actually do things, you have to report on it. Whereas in the case of River Mountain Ranch, you lease your land to someone else who does those reports, etc. Other questions?
Was there any indication how much soil had been lost from one of those chained areas?
Well, there's all those claims, that are broad brush things that are in the order of feet, 6 feet, as numbers I've heard. In that area, the question is, it had been run under sheep from 1882. So the question is, how much soil was actually left and grassland before they chained it? And we don't have, for at least not for free, aerial photos prior to that chaining. So we don't really, and we don't have good reports of what it looked like before the chaining. But that also suffered from another problem. Even after it was subdivided, some of the people still used it as agriculture because it's not under wildlife now. It's just lots and you pay the taxes on the whole lot. For those of you that don't know, in wildlife management, 25-acre parcel, the taxes on it can easily be $45 a year.
Can you say more about the Indians who lived in this area?
I don't have a lot of information about the Indians that lived here other than what was reported by the settlers. I was looking at it from the settlers' viewpoint of what did they actually see the Indians do that they reported and didn't figure out they should have tried to implement some of that rotational grazing and fire themselves. The truth is, the settlers did not, they fundamentally underestimated the amount of land it would take to run N number of head of cattle, because they thought they were used to continuous grazing. Native grasses do not take continuous grazing well. They have to be rotationally grazed, or you see what happens to the root system. And when the root system goes, next drought, maybe the whole plant goes. And oh, by the way, you didn't let it seed out last year because you were feeding your cattle. So now it doesn't have any seedlings, and pretty soon you don't have any native grasses. That's why all those improved grasses, KR Blue Stem and others, were brought in, because they actually grew up in a world where if you can bloom that high, you're a good boy. And they do. They'll bloom an inch to an inch and a half off the ground and seed out. Their whole MO is produce seed. Every time you mow it, they produce another crop of seed. Whether it's grazed or mowed with a mechanical mower, they produce seed.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.